The little black girl told the biker her mom's signal pinged from a sealed chamber beneath the research floors. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a chilly afternoon when little Aaliyah, no more than 8 years old, sprinted across the parking lot of a biker bar, tears streaming down her face. Her small body trembled with fear as she reached out for the nearest biker, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please," she gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "My mom, she's in danger." Her signal, it pinged from a sealed chamber beneath the research floors. The biker she grabbed, a towering man named Jake with a thick beard and tattoos covering both arms, froze in place. He had seen his share of tough situations, but this was different. Aaliyah's words didn't make sense. A sealed chamber? Research floors? What kind of trouble could her mother be in? The other bikers, who had been lounging and chatting by their motorcycles, went silent, sensing the urgency in the air. Aaliyah was shaking, her small hands gripping Jake's vest as if her life depended on it. "What happened?" Jake asked, crouching down to her level, his voice soft yet steady. "Where is she? What's going on?" Aaliyah's voice quivered as she explained, "My mom works at a big research lab. I don't know exactly what it is, but she said it was dangerous. She told me if anything happened, I should run to the bikers. She said you would know what to do." Jake glanced at the other bikers, who were all watching with intense focus. "We need to move," Jake said, his voice calm but commanding. He stood up, looking at his crew. "Get the bikes ready. We're going to help her." The bikers immediately sprang into action, grabbing their helmets and jackets, ready to ride. But Jake wasn't just concerned about Aaliyah's mother. There was something in the girl's eyes, something that told him this wasn't just another rescue mission. It was something much bigger. Aaliyah's mother had been working on something in secret, something so important that it had put her life at risk. Jake could feel it in his gut. As the engines roared to life and the bikers sped off into the fading light of the afternoon, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. What was really going on in that research lab? And why was Aaliyah's mother so sure that the bikers would be the ones to save her? The journey ahead would be dangerous, but Jake knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The roar of the engines echoed through the quiet night as Jake and the rest of the bikers sped down the highway. Aaliyah, still trembling, clung to the back of Jake's bike, her small hands gripping his leather vest. The wind whipped through her hair, but it didn't calm her nerves. She had never been on the back of a motorcycle before, let alone on a ride like this. But she knew one thing for sure: her mom needed her. She could feel it in her gut. The fear that had been gnawing at her since she received the call from her mother had only grown stronger. Something terrible was happening, and she was certain that whatever it wasn't going to end well. As they rode through the night, the flickering lights of distant towns blurred into the horizon. The bikers didn't speak much, but the air was thick with tension. Every few minutes, Jake would glance back at Aaliyah, making sure she was okay. He couldn't help but feel responsible for this little girl now, and her mother's strange message only added to the weight on his shoulders. Aaliyah had said her mom's signal came from a sealed chamber beneath the research floors. Jake didn't understand all the details, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a normal job. This was personal. Jake had heard whispers about the research facility. It was said to be one of the most secretive places in the country, hidden away from the public eye. No one knew exactly what they were working on, but rumors swirled about cutting-edge technology, experimental drugs, and top-secret government projects. But why had Aaliyah's mother gotten involved in something like this? And why was her life now in danger? Jake's mind raced as they continued to ride. The closer they got, the more his instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. His motorcycle roared over the cracked asphalt, the deep hum of the engine vibrating through his body. He could hear the rest of the bikers behind him, their engines a steady chorus, each of them following without question. They were loyal to the end, and this mission was no exception. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake could see the outline of the research facility up ahead. It was massive, an imposing concrete structure that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. There were no signs, no windows, just walls that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. They were finally here. Jake signaled for the bikers to slow down, their formation breaking as they entered the facility's parking lot. The place was eerily quiet, with only a few scattered cars parked near the entrance. Jake killed the engine and turned to Aaliyah. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and steady. Aaliyah nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say a word. They were standing at the edge of something dangerous, and she knew it. Jake led the way toward the building's entrance, the sound of their boots echoing through the empty lot. As they approached, the door opened with a soft hiss, revealing a sterile hallway bathed in harsh fluorescent light. It felt wrong from the moment they stepped inside. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with tension. "Where are we going?" Aaliyah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the others, giving them a silent command to follow. They moved through the hallways, their footsteps muffled on the cold tile floor. Aaliyah stayed close to Jake, her heart racing. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew it couldn't be good. As they rounded a corner, they came to a set of heavy metal doors. Jake pushed one open, and the room beyond was dark, save for a few dim emergency lights. It smelled sterile, like the inside of a hospital, but colder. Aaliyah's stomach twisted with unease as she stepped inside. Her mom's signal had come from here. Somewhere in this place, her mother was waiting for help. But where? Jake turned to the others, his voice low. "We need to find her. Now." As they moved deeper into the facility, Aaliyah felt her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt like it was leading her into a nightmare she wasn't prepared for. She could sense that they were getting closer to something that would change everything. The group continued to move silently through the darkened halls, past locked doors and empty rooms. It felt like they were walking through a maze, but they didn't stop. Every second counted. Somewhere, in the depths of this research facility, Aaliyah's mother was waiting for them. And whatever she had discovered, whatever dangerous knowledge she had uncovered, was about to come to light. The silence in the facility was almost suffocating as Jake and the others moved through the narrow hallways. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting an eerie glow on the concrete floors, while the hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that broke the stillness. Aaliyah's heart was racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she clung to Jake's side. She didn't know what they would find here, but everything about this place felt wrong. They moved quickly, but carefully, eyes scanning every corner for danger. As they reached a fork in the hallway, Jake motioned for the group to stop. He listened for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "We're close," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, tense, ready for anything. Aaliyah looked up at Jake, trying to read his expression, but his face was as unreadable as ever. He had a way of hiding his emotions, even in the most dangerous of situations. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched around his handlebars earlier. Whatever was going on, it was serious. As they proceeded, Aaliyah's mind raced. She couldn't help but think of her mother. What had she gotten herself involved in? What dangerous secrets had she uncovered in this place? The questions swirled in her head, making her feel dizzy. She had no answers, only the gnawing fear that something terrible was about to happen. They finally arrived at a heavy metal door, one that looked far more secure than the others they had passed. Jake pushed against it, but it didn't budge. "Locked," he said, his voice calm but firm. The group quickly went into action, trying to figure out a way inside. Jake gestured for Wrench, one of the bikers, to step forward. Wrench was an expert at breaking into places. His hands were steady and his mind focused. In seconds, he had a small toolkit out, working the lock with practiced precision. Aaliyah stood back, her eyes darting nervously around the hallway. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A soft click echoed in the quiet air as the lock finally disengaged. Jake pushed the door open, and the group slipped inside. The room was dark, save for the dim emergency lights that flickered in the corners. The air smelled stale, almost metallic, and the walls were lined with equipment she didn't recognize. Her mother's signal had come from this room, but where was she? The bikers moved cautiously, scanning the room. Jake led the way, his eyes scanning every corner, looking for any sign of her mother. Aaliyah's heart was in her throat as they made their way deeper into the room. "Mom," she called softly, her voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. Jake turned to her, his expression hard. "Stay close," he warned, before continuing forward. They moved deeper into the room, past rows of equipment and lab tables. Aaliyah's eyes widened as she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, a large steel door stood slightly ajar. The door was almost hidden behind stacks of crates and boxes, but Aaliyah could see the faint outline of a lock on it. Her pulse quickened. This was it, the place her mother had mentioned. She could feel it. Without a word, Jake motioned for the others to follow. The group moved toward the door, each of them tense and alert. Wrench stepped forward, his eyes scanning the lock, ready to break it if needed. But before he could make a move, a voice interrupted them. "What are you doing here?" The voice was cold and authoritative, sending a chill down Aaliyah's spine. A man stepped from the shadows, his face hidden behind a mask. He was tall, dressed in a black suit, and his eyes glowed with a strange intensity. He looked like he belonged in a place like this, cold, clinical, and ruthless. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" Jake asked, stepping forward protectively in front of Aaliyah. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Jake's. "You don't belong here," he said slowly. "This place is beyond your understanding. Leave now, and you won't get hurt." Jake didn't flinch. "Not until we find her," he said firmly, his voice unyielding. The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. "I warned you," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Aaliyah felt a sudden wave of fear wash over her. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but she could sense the danger in the air. Jake stood his ground, his eyes narrowing. "We're not leaving until we find her. You'll have to stop us." The man didn't move at first, his gaze shifting from Jake to Aaliyah, before finally turning his attention to the door in the corner. "You don't know what's behind that door," he said, his voice softer now, almost amused. "You're not ready for what you'll find." But Jake didn't care about the man's words. "Open it," he demanded. The man's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Aaliyah thought he might attack. But instead, he simply turned, walking toward the door with a slow, deliberate pace. "Very well," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." He opened the door, and a cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it the faint smell of chemicals and something else, something metallic. Aaliyah's heart was pounding in her chest as she took a step forward, ready to see what was behind that door. Whatever it was the key to everything, and she was about to find out. The door creaked open with a low, mechanical groan, revealing a dark room beyond. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, and the faint hum of machines filled the space. Aaliyah's heart raced, her eyes wide with uncertainty. She clutched Jake's jacket tighter, the cold chill in the room sending a shiver down her spine. The man who had opened the door stood aside, his face unreadable as he motioned for them to enter. "Go on," he said, his voice low and detached. "See for yourselves." Jake moved forward without hesitation, his footsteps heavy on the cold concrete floor. The rest of the bikers followed, their faces set with determination. Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, glancing at the man who still lingered near the door. She couldn't read him, but something in his eyes told her he wasn't entirely on their side. With a deep breath, she stepped into the room, her eyes immediately drawn to the rows of large metal tanks lining the walls. Each one was filled with a faintly glowing liquid, and inside, the shapes of what appeared to be human figures floated, suspended in the eerie fluid. Aaliyah's stomach twisted. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake's jaw clenched as he surveyed the room. "Whatever it is, it's not good," he muttered. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the air seemed to vibrate with a sense of impending danger. Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that they were trespassing on something far bigger than they could comprehend. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Wrench beside her. "We need to stay focused," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the room with military precision. He was always the calmest of the group, the one who could read the situation without panicking. But even he seemed unnerved by the strange tanks. "Your mom's in here somewhere," he added, his voice firm. Aaliyah nodded, trying to push the fear back down. Her mom was somewhere in this facility, and it was up to them to find her before it was too late. They moved deeper into the room, their boots echoing on the cold floor. Jake led the way, the others following closely behind. The tanks seemed to stretch on forever, each one more unsettling than the last. Aaliyah's eyes flitted from one to the other, unable to focus on any one thing for too long. As they reached the far side of the room, Jake's voice broke the silence. "There," he said, pointing to a small door in the corner. It was unmarked, blending into the wall, but there was something about it that caught his attention. Aaliyah felt her pulse quicken. This was it. They were close. They approached the door cautiously, Jake turning the handle. It opened with a soft click, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. "This is it," Jake said. "Let's move." They didn't hesitate. The group made their way down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The descent seemed endless, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. As they reached the bottom, the door at the end of the stairs swung open, revealing a long corridor. The walls were lined with flickering lights, and the air smelled sterile, like a hospital. Aaliyah's heart hammered in her chest as they moved down the hallway. The walls seemed to close in around them, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She didn't know what they were walking into, but she knew one thing for sure. It was going to change everything. At the end of the corridor was another door, this one made of heavy steel. Jake stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We find her now." He pulled the door open, revealing a large, sterile room, much like the ones they had seen earlier. But this one was different. It was colder, darker, and the machines inside were even more advanced, more complex. Aaliyah's eyes were drawn to the center of the room, where a figure lay unconscious on a medical bed. Her heart stopped. It was her mother. Her heart swelled with relief, but that feeling was quickly replaced by fear as she saw the machines connected to her mother's body. "Mom," Aaliyah whispered, her voice cracking. Jake moved forward quickly, his hand on Aaliyah's back, urging her to stay close. "We need to get her out of here," he said. Wrench stepped forward, examining the machines. "These are some serious systems," he muttered, running his fingers over the controls. "This isn't just a medical facility, it's something else. Something experimental." Aaliyah could barely hear him over the pounding in her ears. Her mother was here, but she was connected to machines that looked far too dangerous. The walls were closing in. "We need to hurry," Jake said, his voice urgent. "This place is too dangerous. Let's move." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Aaliyah froze. Someone was coming. "We need to get her out of here now," Jake said, his voice low and intense. The bikers sprang into action, grabbing her mother and carefully disconnecting her from the machines. They moved quickly, but Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She turned to look at the door, her heart racing. Whatever they had just uncovered, it was about to get a lot more dangerous. The sound of footsteps grew louder. They had to leave. Now. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake and the rest of the bikers rushed to get Aaliyah's mother out of the facility. The machines around them hummed ominously, their cold metallic surfaces reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. Aaliyah's heart was racing, her eyes locked on her unconscious mother, who was now being carefully lifted from the medical bed. Despite the relief of finally finding her, something deep inside Aaliyah told her this wasn't over. They were far from safe. As the bikers worked quickly to disconnect the last of the machines from her mother's body, the sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder. The facility was coming alive, and they didn't have much time. "Hurry up," Jake muttered under his breath, his eyes darting to the door. The heavy sound of boots echoed in the distance, signaling the approach of whoever was on the other side. Aaliyah felt a surge of panic. They needed to move faster. They had no idea who was coming, but the urgency was clear. Jake grabbed Aaliyah's mother, his strong arms supporting her frail body as they began to move towards the exit. Wrench and the others were already covering the rear, making sure no one was following too closely. But as they reached the door, the sound of footsteps intensified. The bikers moved in a tight formation, staying low to avoid detection. The facility's sterile halls suddenly felt like a maze. Each turn, each door, felt like another obstacle in their path. "This way," Jake ordered, leading them down a narrow passage. They were getting closer to the exit, but the danger was escalating with every step. Aaliyah's mother, still unconscious, was limp in Jake's arms, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Aaliyah couldn't help but feel guilty for not knowing sooner that her mother was in danger. She had no idea what kind of research her mother had been involved in, but it was clear now that whatever it was, it had put them all in harm's way. The bikers pressed forward, their boots echoing in the narrow hallway as they moved swiftly but cautiously. As they neared the exit, Jake held up a hand, signaling for everyone to stop. He motioned for Wrench to check the hallway ahead. Wrench crept forward, his movements silent and precise, his eyes scanning every corner for potential threats. The silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. Just as Wrench reached the end of the hallway, the sound of more footsteps echoed from the other direction. "They're closing in," Wrench whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Jake's eyes narrowed. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "Let's move." They rushed forward, the sound of their footsteps muffled on the cold concrete floor. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the exit. The door was just ahead, a faint light spilling in from the outside, offering a glimpse of freedom. But just as they reached for the door handle, it swung open, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway. Aaliyah froze. The man in front of them was tall, dressed in a black suit, his face cold and unreadable. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to stop them in their tracks. The group came to a halt, unsure of what to do next. Jake stood in front of Aaliyah and her mother, his body tense, ready for anything. The man in the doorway didn't move, his gaze fixed on them, as if he were waiting for them to make a move. "What are you doing here?" The man's voice was cold, detached, but there was a subtle edge to it that sent a chill down Aaliyah's spine. Jake didn't answer immediately. He stood his ground, sizing up the man in front of him. "We're leaving," Jake said, his voice firm. The man raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Not so fast," he said, stepping forward, blocking the door. "You've seen things you shouldn't have." Jake's jaw tightened. "We're taking her with us," he said, motioning to Aaliyah's mother. The man's expression didn't change. "You're too late," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking with fear. The man's eyes shifted to Aaliyah, then back to Jake. "It's already too late," he repeated. "You're in way over your heads." Before anyone could react, the sound of more footsteps echoed from behind them, growing louder by the second. The man in the doorway turned, his gaze flickering with something like annoyance. "I told you this wouldn't end well," he muttered, stepping aside. "But if you want to continue, I won't stop you." With that, he turned and walked back into the shadows. The group stood frozen, uncertain of what to do next. But Jake didn't hesitate. "Move," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. Without another word, the bikers rushed forward, pushing past the man and out into the night. The cold air hit them like a wall as they stepped outside, the weight of their mission still hanging over them. Aaliyah's mother was still unconscious, but she was alive, and for now, that was all that mattered. The man's words echoed in Aaliyah's mind, though. "It's already too late." What did he mean by that? What had they really stumbled into? She didn't know, but she was about to find out. The cold night air hit them as they rushed out of the facility, the sound of their footsteps echoing across the parking lot. Jake, Aaliyah, and the rest of the bikers moved quickly, their eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Aaliyah's heart was still pounding in her chest, the words of the man they had encountered echoing in her mind. "It's already too late." What did that mean? Had they missed their chance to stop whatever was happening at the research facility? Was there something worse waiting for them? She couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over yet. Aaliyah's mother, though still unconscious, was safe for the moment, but they were far from out of harm's way. The rest of the bikers, who had been so focused on getting her out of the facility, were now tense, their movements quick and efficient, as if they knew the clock was ticking. Jake's eyes darted to the horizon, searching for any signs of movement. They were in unfamiliar territory now, and the facility they had just left was only a small part of a much larger and far more dangerous game. "Keep moving," Jake said, his voice low and steady. His tone left no room for argument. The group quickened their pace, heading toward their bikes, which were parked a short distance away. Aaliyah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she knew there was no turning back now. Whatever they were running from, whatever had been set in motion by her mother's discovery, They couldn't stop until they found the answers. They reached the bikes, and Jake quickly loaded Aaliyah's mother onto the back of his bike, making sure she was secure. Aaliyah climbed on behind him, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. How had they gotten involved in something so dangerous? Her mother had been working on something in that facility, something that had put them all in harm's way. They had to find out what it was. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life as they sped away from the facility. The night was dark, and the road stretched ahead of them like an endless ribbon of asphalt. Aaliyah's thoughts were consumed by her mother, by the danger they had just escaped, and by the feeling that they were being hunted. As they rode through the night, the only sounds were the hum of the engines and the rush of the wind. It felt like they were flying, escaping into the unknown. But the further they went, the more Aaliyah's anxiety grew. The man at the facility had warned them, but there was no time to dwell on his words. They had to keep moving. Jake's motorcycle surged ahead, cutting through the night with precision. He was determined, focused, and Aaliyah could feel the weight of his resolve. She tried to steady her breath, but her mind was too cluttered with questions. What had her mother uncovered in that lab? Who were the people behind the facility? And why had they been so eager to stop them from leaving? The answers were just out of reach, but she knew they were getting closer. The group rode in formation, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Each biker was vigilant, aware that any moment could bring danger. Jake led them through the winding roads, the landscape blurring in the darkness. The only thing that mattered now was getting away, getting somewhere safe. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake signaled for them to slow down. The tension in the air was thick, and Aaliyah could feel her heart beating in her chest. She looked around, searching for any sign of danger, but all she saw were the quiet streets of the small town. They had made it this far, but there was still no telling who was after them, or what they would face. Next, we need to lay low for a while, Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension. We'll stop at a safe house. The group nodded, knowing that staying in one place for too long was dangerous. They needed to stay on the move, keep their heads down, and figure out what had been happening at that research facility. As they continued down the dark streets, Aaliyah's mind raced with thoughts of her mother. She was alive, yes, but what had they uncovered in that facility? What had she been involved in? And who else was out there, watching them? The answers were still unclear, but Aaliyah knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The danger was far from over, and the truth was somewhere ahead, waiting to be discovered. They arrived at the safe house just before dawn, the sun still hidden beneath the horizon, casting a dim, gray light over the quiet street. The house was an old two-story building, tucked away in a secluded neighborhood where no one would look twice at a group of bikers rolling in. Jake was the first to dismount, his gaze scanning the surroundings before he gave a sharp nod, signaling that it was safe for the others to follow. The bikers began unloading, their movements swift and efficient as they moved Aaliyah's mother into the house. Aaliyah stayed close to her mother, still holding onto the uncertainty that gnawed at her. She watched as Jake and the rest of the bikers secured the area, checking the windows, locking doors, making sure no one had followed them. The adrenaline from their escape had started to wear off, but a nagging feeling in Aaliyah's gut told her that the worst was yet to come. She couldn't ignore the man's words back at the facility, the warning that it was already too late. What did that mean? Had they been too late in stopping whatever had been set in motion? Was it even possible to stop it now? As the group settled in, Wrench pulled Aaliyah aside. "You okay?" he asked, his expression softening as he looked at her. Aaliyah managed a shaky nod. "I don't know," she replied. She trailed off, her thoughts jumbled. "I don't know what we're dealing with. My mom, she was working on something. Something they didn't want getting out." Wrench's face grew serious. "We'll figure it out," he said, giving her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "But right now, you need to rest. We all need to." The weight of the day, the night, was finally starting to hit her. Aaliyah felt the exhaustion settle in her bones, but she couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. She sat down in a chair, her gaze lingering on her unconscious mother, still hooked up to the medical devices the bikers had managed to disconnect. A deep, uneasy silence filled the room as the bikers gathered around, taking their positions as sentries, watching the windows, the door. They were on high alert, expecting someone to come for them. Aaliyah glanced at Jake, who was sitting across the room, His eyes narrowed in concentration. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "We figure out what your mom was working on," he said simply. "And we get ahead of whoever's coming after us." Aaliyah nodded, but she didn't feel reassured. She had no idea what they were up against, and she had no idea how they were going to stop it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. Wrench was the first to answer it, his face tensing as he listened to the other end of the line. He hung up after a few seconds and turned to Jake. "They know we're here," he said, his voice low. "We need to move." Jake stood up, his jaw tightening. "Get ready," he said, his voice commanding. "We're not staying here." The bikers quickly gathered their things, moving with practiced efficiency as they prepared to leave. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. Where were they going? What was going to happen next? She felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Jake organize the group. He was calm, focused, but Aaliyah could see the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't saying it, but she could feel it. This was bigger than anything they'd dealt with before. "We have to get your mom out of here," Jake said to Aaliyah as he moved toward her. "We can't afford to stay in one place for too long. We'll find a new spot." Aaliyah nodded, trying to push the panic down. She glanced at her mother, who still lay unconscious, looking frail and vulnerable. She couldn't help but wonder what her mother had uncovered, what she had gotten herself into. And most importantly, who were the people after them? As the bikers prepared to leave, Aaliyah felt the weight of the situation sink in. It was no longer just about getting her mother to safety. It was about surviving whatever was coming for them. And she had no idea what that would look like. They loaded her mother into a van, and Jake climbed into the front seat, his eyes scanning the street once more. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. Aaliyah climbed in beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. The bikers followed closely behind, their engines rumbling as they made their way through the streets. The sound of their motorcycles cut through the silence of the early morning, a steady reminder that they were on the move. The tension in the air was thick as they drove through the quiet city, Aaliyah staring out the window, her mind racing. They were being hunted, but who was hunting them? And what had her mother found that was so dangerous? She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving, keep running, until they figured out what had started and how to end it. The road stretched out in front of them, an endless path into the unknown, but Aaliyah was determined to stay with her mother, to see this through, whatever it took. The van sped through the empty streets, the sound of its tires humming against the asphalt as it cut through the early morning silence. Jake's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, looking for any sign of pursuit. Aaliyah sat beside him, her thoughts a whirlwind as she watched the road pass by, her mind racing with questions. What had her mother gotten herself involved in? Why were people willing to go to such lengths to stop them from leaving that research facility? And who was that man? The one who had warned them it was too late. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that whatever danger was looming wasn't something they could outrun. Jake glanced at Aaliyah, his eyes steady despite the situation. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Aaliyah nodded, but she didn't trust the answer. "I just want to know what's going on," she said, her voice shaky. "My mom, she was working on something. I know it. And now," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jake's jaw tightened. He understood all too well the feeling of being in the dark, of not knowing who the enemy was or what they were capable of. He had been through this kind of thing before, though not like this. This was different. Whatever was going on with Aaliyah's mother, it was bigger than either of them realized. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice steady. "Right now, we need to keep moving. We can't let anyone catch up with us." Aaliyah nodded, her eyes never leaving the passing scenery. They had to keep moving, but she felt like they were running out of time. It didn't take long for the group to reach their next destination, a small, secluded cabin hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. Jake parked the van outside, and the bikers immediately began to unload. Aaliyah's mother was still unconscious, but at least now she was breathing more steadily. It was a relief, but only temporary. The feeling of danger still hung in the air, thick and oppressive. "Get the place locked down," Jake instructed, his voice firm. "We need to make sure no one finds us here." The bikers worked quickly, securing the area and making sure they had an escape route if things went south. Aaliyah helped as much as she could, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in a sea of thoughts. What had her mother uncovered in that facility? And who were the people that were so intent on keeping them from leaving? A few hours passed, and the group had settled into the cabin. The fire crackled in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. Aaliyah sat by her mother, her eyes fixed on the woman who had always been her rock. Her mother was still pale, her breathing shallow, but she was alive. That was something. The door creaked open, and Jake stepped in, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said, his tone serious. Aaliyah stood up immediately. "What is it?" she asked, her heart racing again. "The people from the facility, they're closing in on us. They know we're here." Aaliyah felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's eyes were hard as steel. "We got a tip-off. Someone from the inside reached out. They said they're sending a team to find us. We don't have much time." Aaliyah's stomach twisted into knots. They had no choice but to run again. But this time, they weren't just running from some random threat. They were running from the very people who had been controlling her mother's research. People who had no problem using force to get what they wanted. "We need to move fast," Jake said. "Get your mom ready to go. We're leaving soon." Aaliyah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how they were going to escape, but there was no time to waste. They had to get out of there before the facility's people found them. As the bikers packed up and prepared to leave, Aaliyah felt the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her. Her mind raced, but no answers came. What was her mother's research? Why had it put them in such danger? Who were the people after them? And most importantly, could they really escape? As they loaded up the van and got ready to hit the road again, Aaliyah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the worst was yet to come. They were in deeper than they realized, and the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But at what cost? They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would have to confront whatever was coming for them. And when they did, Aaliyah knew it would be a battle like nothing they had ever faced before. The van rumbled down the winding back roads, the trees on either side blurring as they sped away from the cabin. Aaliyah sat in the back, clutching her mother's limp hand, her mind racing. The weight of everything that had happened in the past few days felt almost too much to bear. They were being hunted, her mother was still unconscious, and they had no idea who was truly behind all of this. All they had were more questions and the constant fear that they were running out of time. Jake kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable, but Aaliyah could tell he was just as tense as she was. The silence in the van was thick, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The rest of the bikers followed close behind, their engines roaring like thunder, ready for anything. The plan was simple: get to a new location, lay low, and figure out what was going on. But the closer they got to their destination, the more Aaliyah felt the pressure building. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the gnawing uncertainty that no matter how far they ran, they wouldn't be able to escape the truth. Her mother had been working on something at that facility, something so powerful and dangerous that it had set off a chain of events that none of them could control. And now, they were in the middle of it. "How much farther?" Aaliyah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake glanced over at her, his eyes dark with worry. "Not far. Just a few more miles." But the look on his face told her that even he wasn't sure what was coming next. They had no real plan. They were just moving, hoping that the next place would offer them some kind of safety. But Aaliyah had a sinking feeling that wherever they went, it wouldn't be enough. As the miles passed, Aaliyah's mind kept drifting back to that man, the one who had warned them at the facility. "It's too late," he had said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." What did that mean? What was it that they didn't know? And why had her mother been so involved in something so secretive, so dangerous? She looked down at her mother's pale face. She had always been the strong one, the protector, the person Aaliyah had relied on for everything. Now, she was lying there, vulnerable, caught in the middle of something neither of them understood. Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that her mother had been keeping secrets that had put them both in the line of fire. "We need to figure this out," Aaliyah said to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of the van's engine. "We have to." As the van rounded a bend in the road, Jake's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're here." Aaliyah looked up, her eyes scanning the area. It was a small, rundown motel, tucked away off the main road. The lights outside flickered, and the place looked like it had seen better days. But it would have to do. Jake parked the van behind the building, out of sight, and the group quickly unloaded. The bikers worked in silence, each of them understanding the gravity of the situation. Aaliyah's heart was still pounding in her chest as they helped her mother out of the van. She felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that they had made it this far, but fear because she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. "Let's get inside," Jake said, his voice low but firm. They moved quickly, Aaliyah following closely behind, her mother still unconscious in her arms. The motel room was small, but it was secure. The bikers set up a perimeter, watching for any sign of movement outside. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Aaliyah sat down on the bed next to her mother, her mind still racing. She had no idea what they had uncovered at the facility, but she knew it was something big, something dangerous. And now, they were all part of it. "We need to get answers," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't just keep running. We need to find out who's behind this, and why they're after us." Aaliyah looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "But how?" she asked. "How do we even begin to figure this out?" Jake's gaze softened as he looked at her. "We'll start by getting your mom to wake up. Once she's stable, we'll go through everything she was working on. We'll find out what she was involved in, and who's pulling the strings. And then we'll make sure they don't hurt anyone else." The words were simple, but Aaliyah could hear the resolve in his voice. He was right. They couldn't run forever. They had to take action, and they had to take it now. As the night stretched on, Aaliyah sat by her mother's side, waiting for the moment when she would wake up. She had no idea what was ahead, but she knew one thing. They couldn't stay in the shadows forever. They had to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The morning light filtered weakly through the motel's curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Aaliyah sat by her mother's side, watching her every breath, her heart still racing from the events that had unfolded. Jake and the rest of the bikers had kept watch throughout the night, their vigilance unwavering. But Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The danger they were in wasn't something that could be outrun, and the truth about her mother's work felt more elusive with every passing minute. She hadn't been able to sleep. Every time her mother shifted or made the slightest sound, Aaliyah's pulse quickened, hoping that the woman who had always been her rock would wake up and explain everything. But her mother remained unconscious, her breathing shallow. Aaliyah couldn't stand the silence. She glanced over at Jake, who was sitting across the room, staring out the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot. He was always so composed, always taking charge, but Aaliyah could see the toll it was taking on him. This wasn't just another mission to him. It was personal. The man who had warned them back at the facility, the one who said it was too late, had been right about one thing. They were in over their heads. Aaliyah wasn't sure if they could find their way out, but they had to try. She stood up slowly, stretching her legs. The tension in her body was palpable, and she couldn't just sit around waiting anymore. She had to know what was happening. Her mother's life was hanging in the balance, and Aaliyah couldn't afford to be passive. As if on cue, her mother stirred on the bed. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. She rushed to her mother's side, gently shaking her. "Mom," she whispered urgently. "Mom, wake up." It took a moment, but then her mother's eyes fluttered open, and Aaliyah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her mother's eyes were groggy at first, unfocused, but then she seemed to recognize her daughter's face. "Aaliyah," she croaked, her voice raspy. Aaliyah's relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by the same gnawing fear she had felt since the moment they left the research facility. "Mom, what happened? What were you working on? Why are we being hunted?" Her mother's eyes flickered with something, a mix of fear and regret, before she let out a long, exhausted sigh. "You don't understand. Sweetheart, it's worse than I ever thought." She paused, her breath shallow. "The research I was part of, it wasn't just about science. It was about power, control." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. She had a sinking feeling that her mother wasn't just talking about scientific experiments. "What do you mean, Mom?" Her mother struggled to sit up, but Aaliyah helped her, gently propping her up with pillows. "There's a group, powerful people, who have been using my research for things I never agreed to. They wanted to weaponize it. They wanted to control the human mind." Aaliyah's heart pounded as her mother's words sank in. "Weaponize?" she repeated, her voice shaking. What exactly did you find? What were you working on? Her mother's eyes flickered to Jake, who was still standing by the window, watching them closely. I was working on a project that could change the way we understand consciousness itself, her mother continued, her voice faint but firm. But the more I discovered, the more I realized they were using it for military purposes, using it to manipulate people, to control them. Jake turned, his face a mask of concern. Is that what they're after? He asked, his voice low. Her mother nodded, her eyes closing briefly as she gathered her strength. Yes, they're after the data I've gathered. They want to finish what they started, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Aaliyah's mind was spinning. Everything her mother had said made sense, but it also terrified her. This wasn't just some random conspiracy. These were people with the means to make their research a reality. People who could do untold damage. But why us? Aaliyah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are they coming after us now? Her mother's gaze softened, but there was sadness in her eyes. Because I tried to stop them. I tried to warn them that what they were doing was wrong. And now they're afraid of what I know. They're afraid I might be able to stop them. And they'll do anything to make sure I can't. Aaliyah could barely process her mother's words. They were in the middle of something much bigger than they had realized. She wasn't just a pawn in a game. She was caught in the crossfire of a war that was being fought in the shadows. What do we do now? Aaliyah asked, her voice trembling. Her mother took a deep breath, then looked her directly in the eyes. We fight back, she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. We have to finish what I started. We have to stop them before they can use this technology for their own gain. Aaliyah nodded slowly, her heart heavy but resolute. She didn't know how they were going to take on an enemy so powerful, but one thing was clear. They couldn't run anymore. The truth was out, and now they had to face it head-on. The fight for their lives, and for the future, had only just begun. The room was filled with a tense silence as Aaliyah and her mother processed the gravity of their situation. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of their decisions, the truth of the danger they were in now crystal clear. Her mother, still frail but determined, had spoken of a war that was already in motion, a war that had nothing to do with borders or armies, but everything to do with control. Control of minds, of bodies, of the very essence of free will. It was a kind of power most people couldn't even comprehend, but her mother had been fighting it all along. Now it was time to finish what had been started. Jake was the first to break the silence, his voice calm, but filled with urgency. What's our plan then? He asked, looking directly at Aaliyah's mother, who had now propped herself up in the chair, her eyes focused and sharp despite the exhaustion etched on her face. She took a deep breath, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for a glass of water on the nearby table. We need to destroy the data, she said, her voice steady. It's the only way. If they get their hands on it, it's over. Aaliyah's mind raced. Destroy it, she echoed. But how? Her mother looked at her with a knowing, almost sorrowful expression. The data is stored in multiple secure locations. There's a main server at the facility, heavily guarded. But there's another copy, in a backup lab outside the city. It's less secure, but still not easy to get to. Jake was already moving, his mind working fast. We'll hit the backup lab first, he said, determination in his voice. If we can get to it before they do, we'll take care of the rest. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. And if they're already there? She asked, her voice low, fearful. Then we take whatever risks we need to, Jake replied, his tone unwavering. We can't afford to hesitate. Her mother's eyes softened as she looked at Aaliyah. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. I never wanted you to be involved in any of this. But if you choose to stay, you're in this with us. We do it together or not at all. Aaliyah's heart clenched, and for a moment, the reality of the situation hit her all at once. Her mother had been thrust into something far beyond her control, and now Aaliyah was in the middle of it too. But she couldn't back down now, not when they were so close. I'm with you, Mom, Aaliyah said, her voice firm. We'll finish this together. Her mother gave a small nod, pride and relief flickering in her eyes. Jake looked at them both, then motioned to the rest of the bikers, who were silently preparing for the next phase. Get ready, he ordered. We move out in 15. The plan was set. The backup lab was their next target, and they had to move quickly. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that someone would find them. Aaliyah's mind raced as she thought about the backup lab. It was a small facility, Nothing like the massive research center they had escaped from, but it was still heavily fortified. The bikers weren't unfamiliar with danger, but this would be different. They weren't just facing a hostile group. They were up against an organized, powerful entity that had resources far beyond anything they had. The group piled into their vehicles, engines roaring to life. Aaliyah climbed into the back of the van with her mother, who was now awake and alert, but still weak. "Stay close," Jake told Aaliyah, his tone more serious than before. "We're not out of danger yet." As they pulled out of the motel's parking lot, the weight of the mission settled heavily on Aaliyah's shoulders. They were on the move again, racing against time in the shadow of an enemy that was closing in. The city was just beginning to wake up, the streets quiet and empty as they sped through them. But Aaliyah knew that silence wouldn't last long. They were being hunted, and soon, they would have to face whatever forces were after them head-on. The road ahead was unclear, but Aaliyah felt a strange sense of purpose building inside her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about stopping something far bigger than any of them had realized. It was about protecting the truth. And no matter what it took, she was going to make sure they succeeded. The van sped through the winding roads, the trees flashing past in a blur of dark shapes as Aaliyah sat next to her unconscious mother, her mind still reeling from everything they had learned. They were headed toward the backup lab, a small facility hidden far from the main research center. But even as they raced toward their destination, Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jake was focused on the road, but every now and then he glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression tense. The bikers followed closely behind, their motorcycles a dark line of steel and leather, each of them on high alert. The air was thick with the weight of what was coming, and Aaliyah could feel the urgency building inside her. Her mother's health was still fragile, but it wasn't just her health they were racing to protect. It was the truth. Her mother had uncovered something dangerous, and now, they were going to make sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. Aaliyah's thoughts were interrupted as the van jolted over a bump, and her eyes snapped to her mother. Her heart raced when she saw her mother's eyes flutter open, a faint, tired smile on her face. "Aaliyah," she whispered, her voice weak. "Mom, you're awake," Aaliyah said, relief flooding her. Her mother's smile widened slightly. "How's the plan?" she asked softly, still groggy but trying to focus. Aaliyah glanced at Jake, who was keeping his eyes on the road, then back at her mother. "We're going to the backup lab. We'll destroy the data there, just like you said." Her mother nodded slowly, her eyes closing again as if the simple exertion of speaking had drained her. "Make sure it's gone. If they get it, it's all over." Aaliyah swallowed hard, her stomach tightening. She had no idea what kind of power these people had or what they were capable of, but the fear in her mother's voice was enough to make her understand. The stakes. If they didn't stop them, everything would change. The world would change. The silence in the van was heavy, each of them lost in their thoughts as they sped down the road. The bikers moved in tight formation behind them, a wall of protection. Aaliyah felt a strange sense of safety despite the chaos around them. These people weren't just bikers. They were her family now, each of them united by loyalty and a shared sense of purpose. It wasn't long before they reached the outskirts of town, and Jake's voice broke through the silence. "We're close. Stay alert." Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat as the van turned off the main road and into a heavily wooded area. The backup lab was hidden deep in the forest, far away from the eyes of the public, which made it harder to find, but also harder to escape if things went wrong. The van slowed as they approached a large steel gate, the only indication of the lab's existence. Jake pulled up to the gate, and the bikers dismounted in one smooth motion, taking their positions. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. He helped Aaliyah's mother out of the van, and they walked toward the gate. The bikers flanked them, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. The air felt thick with anticipation, and Aaliyah could feel her pulse quicken. They reached the gate, and Jake signaled to Wrench, who stepped forward and started working on the lock. Wrench's movements were precise, his hands steady as he picked the lock with practiced ease. A few moments later, the gate creaked open, revealing a narrow path that led to the facility. "We've got a limited window," Jake said, glancing back at the group. "We move fast. Get in, get the data, and get out." No mistakes. The bikers nodded, their faces hard with determination. Aaliyah's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and adrenaline. They were about to break into a heavily guarded facility, and she had no idea what to expect. They moved quickly down the path, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the dense trees surrounding them. As they neared the facility, the lights flickered on in the distance, and Aaliyah could see the outline of the building, a squat, unassuming structure, but she knew better than to think it was as simple as it seemed. Jake motioned for the group to stop. "Get ready," he whispered. "Once we're inside, we don't stop until we're out." Aaliyah could feel her nerves tightening, but she pushed the fear aside. They had come this far. They couldn't back down now. They reached the entrance, and Jake stepped forward, signaling for the rest of the group to follow. The door was locked, but it wasn't a problem for Wrench, who quickly got to work on the lock. A few tense moments later, the door clicked open, and they were inside. The facility was quiet, almost too quiet, and Aaliyah's senses were on high alert. They moved quickly through the halls, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly as they passed through security checkpoints. They were getting closer to the main server room. Aaliyah's heart raced in her chest. It was almost too easy, but she knew better than to trust that things were going smoothly. Whatever was waiting for them in that room was going to be a fight, and they had to be ready. They reached the door to the server room, and Jake signaled for them to stop. He glanced at the others, his eyes hard. "This is it. We do this right, and we walk out of here." Wrench stepped forward, his fingers flying over the keypad. A few seconds later, the door clicked open. Inside, rows of servers blinked in the dim light. The data they needed was in there. Aaliyah stepped inside, her hands shaking as she approached the terminal. They didn't have much time. If they were going to stop this, it had to be now. The room was tense as Aaliyah stood before the terminal, her hands shaking as she tried to focus on the task at hand. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. They had come this far, and now, with just a few keystrokes, the future would be decided. Jake stood behind her, his eyes scanning the door as the rest of the bikers kept watch. Time was running out, and every second felt like an eternity. Aaliyah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. The data they needed was right there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every click of the keys seemed to echo in the silence of the room, and the soft hum of the servers was the only sound keeping her company. "You're sure this is it?" she whispered, glancing back at her mother, who was still sitting weakly on a nearby chair. Her mother gave a tired nod, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with determination. "This is the heart of it," she said quietly. "Everything they've been working on, every secret, every plan, they're all here. Destroy it, Aaliyah. No matter what, don't let them get their hands on it." Aaliyah took a deep breath and began typing faster, her fingers flying over the keys. The screen blinked to life, showing rows of encrypted files. She had learned enough from her mother's notes to know how to access the data. As the progress bar filled up, Aaliyah felt her pulse quicken. It was working. They were so close now. But as the files began to decrypt, she heard something, a faint sound from outside the server room. Footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat. "They're coming," she whispered. Jake didn't hesitate. "Finish what you're doing," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "We'll hold them off." Aaliyah nodded, her hands moving with urgency now. The files were almost open. She could almost see the light at the end of the tunnel. But then, the door to the server room slammed open. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat as a group of armed men stormed inside. "Stop right there," one of them barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Aaliyah froze, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. They had been so close, too close. "Aaliyah, get down," Jake shouted, pushing her out of the way just as gunshots rang out. The bikers moved fast, their instincts kicking in as they took cover and returned fire. Aaliyah's heart was racing as she scrambled to the ground, her hands still gripping the keyboard. She couldn't let them stop her. She couldn't let them win. Her fingers moved frantically as she continued to work the terminal, her mind blocking out the chaos around her. She had to finish this. It was the only way. More gunshots rang out, the sound of impact reverberating through the room. Aaliyah's hands were slick with sweat, but she didn't stop. With a final, desperate press of the enter key, the files began to delete. The screen flashed once, then went black. The data was gone. Aaliyah looked up just in time to see Jake and the others ducking behind cover as the armed men advanced, their weapons aimed. But the bikers weren't backing down. They were standing their ground, each of them ready to protect the group no matter the cost. "It's done," Aaliyah whispered, her voice shaky but filled with a sense of relief. Her mother, who had been watching from behind the desk, finally exhaled, the weight lifting from her shoulders. "Good," she said softly. "You did it. Now we get out of here." Jake motioned for the group to fall back. They had done their part, but the fight wasn't over yet. The bikers were fast, moving like shadows through the building as they created a path toward the exit. Aaliyah's heart was still racing as they made their way out, her eyes darting from one corner to the next, expecting an ambush at any moment. The air was thick with tension, but they were almost there. The exit was just ahead. As they burst through the back door, Aaliyah felt the cool night air hit her face, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she could breathe. But the danger wasn't over. They had destroyed the data, but the people behind the facility weren't going to give up so easily. They had to keep moving. The bikers wasted no time, getting onto their motorcycles and quickly starting the engines. Aaliyah climbed into the van beside her mother, her pulse still racing, but now there was a spark of hope in her chest. They had taken the first step in stopping the nightmare that had begun with her mother's research. As the engines roared to life, Aaliyah looked at Jake, who was already leading the way. "We'll be all right," he said, his voice firm. "We're not done yet, but we've got a chance now." Aaliyah nodded, her grip tightening on her mother's hand. They had come this far. Now, there was no turning back. They were going to finish this together. In this gripping tale of courage, danger, and redemption, we dive deep into the world of Hell Angels stories, where loyalty and bravery are put to the ultimate test. The story follows Aaliyah, a young woman caught in the chaos of her mother's secretive and dangerous research, and the group of bikers who stand by her as they fight to stop a powerful and shadowy organization from seizing control. As Aaliyah and her mother uncover the dark truths hidden behind a series of experiments, they must rely on the unwavering support of the Hell Angels story's fiercest protectors. The bikers, led by Jake, fight against time and overwhelming odds to keep Aaliyah and her mother safe, racing to destroy the data that could change the world. Along the way, they confront deadly enemies and uncover secrets that were never meant to be revealed. From intense action scenes to emotional moments of loss and survival, these Hell Angels stories capture the strength of family, the power of loyalty, and the relentless pursuit of justice. With every twist and turn, the stakes grow higher, and the bikers must dig deep to overcome the dangers lurking in the shadows. If you are a fan of thrilling, high-stakes narratives, this story will keep you on the edge of your seat, as the Hell Angels stories unfold into a battle for survival that will change everything. With the future hanging in the balance, Aaliyah and the bikers must fight not only for their lives but for the truth itself. Don't miss out on this unforgettable journey that is bound to become one of the most intense Hell Angels stories you've ever heard.